They say every war has two fronts, the one you can see and the one that remains hidden. And in World War II, that hidden front was not located on any map. It was behind barbed wire, locked gates, concrete walls, and unmarked buildings where the rules of war were rewritten, twisted, or ignored entirely. Most people know the battles, the generals, the tanks, the explosions, but far fewer know what happened after the fighting stopped, when a soldier fell into enemy hands. What happened next wasn't shown in newsreels. It wasn't talked about at victory parades, and in many cases, the soldiers who survived it rarely spoke of it aloud, because captivity was its own battlefield. And for millions of soldiers, this battlefield was more terrifying, unpredictable, and psychologically crushing than the front lines. Before we begin, if you're the kind of person who wants to uncover the hidden side of history, the parts that textbooks never told you, make sure you stay with us. And if you love war documentaries and forgotten stories from World War II, consider joining this channel. It helps these stories stay alive, and it pushes more hidden truths into the world. The story begins on a cold morning in 1940, somewhere in Northern Europe, where a convoy of captured Allied soldiers, American, British, French, English, marched slowly through the trees. Their hands were above their heads. Their boots crunched through frost. German guards watched them with rifles ready, their breath drifting like smoke in the freezing air. What the soldiers didn't yet know was that their war was about to change. For centuries, armies had captured enemy troops, but World War II was different. It was global, ideological, ruthless, and stretched across continents. Traditional rules, like those written in the Geneva Convention, collapsed depending on who captured you and what part of the world you fell into. A captured American pilot in Europe faced a completely different fate than a captured Soviet infantryman on the Eastern Front. A British commando taken in Norway faced different conditions than an Australian captured in the Pacific. And a German taken by the Soviets lived a different story altogether. The rules blurred, the lines broke, humanity flickered. The first surprise most Allied soldiers faced was the interrogation, not the violent, torture-filled scenes Hollywood likes to depict. No, German intelligence officers were often cold, clinical, and disturbingly polite. They knew something far more effective than pain. They used silence, they used hunger, they used psychological pressure, they used misinformation. Your unit was wiped out, there's no point resisting, you're forgotten. And for many soldiers, this was the first crack. After processing, soldiers were sent to POW camps, stalags for enlisted men, offlags for officers. Thousands of these camps spread across Germany, Austria, Poland, and occupied territories. At first glance, many POW camps looked like small military towns, barracks, guard towers, fences, parade grounds. But the inside told a different story. Overcrowding, disease, starvation-level rations, and freezing winters where men wrapped their feet in newspaper because they had no socks left. Every captured soldier learned one truth fast. Freedom is not taken all at once. It is taken slowly, in weeks, in months, in routines. Wake-up call, roll call, thin soup, work detail, roll call again, lights out. Over time, the walls closing in were not just physical. They were psychological. One British prisoner later wrote that the most dangerous weapon the guards had wasn't the rifle. It was boredom. The hours that never ended, the days that blended into each other, the feeling that the war outside was moving on without you. But some camps were worse. Some were designed not just to contain, but to break. One of the most brutal realities of World War II captivity was faced by Soviet soldiers held by Nazi Germany. In the eyes of Hitler's command, Soviet POWs were not protected by the Geneva Convention. They were considered subhumans, disposable, replaceable. The result was catastrophic. They were starved, exposed to winter without adequate clothing, herded into open-air pens, denied medical care, treated as forced labor, and in many cases executed without record. It is estimated by historians on both sides that over 3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity. 3 million. A number so large it doesn't feel real until you remember that each number was a human being, a soldier, a son, a friend, a voice that will never speak again. Yet even in the darkest moments there were glimpses of humanity. A German guard sneaking an extra piece of bread to a prisoner. A Soviet officer sharing the last of his frozen potato with a younger soldier. Moments of mercy that defied the ideology of war. But captivity wasn't only brutality, it was also absurdity. Take Stalag Luft III, the camp now famous for the Great Escape. It was a camp built specifically for Allied airmen, many of whom had engineering backgrounds. So the Germans thought they would be harder to contain. They were right. Allied prisoners turned the camp into a hidden laboratory, forging papers, building compasses from razor blades, creating tunnels with makeshift ventilation systems, cooking up diversion tactics that were nearly theatrical. One prisoner spent weeks pretending to limp only to hide tunnel dirt inside his fake cast. Others developed penguin suits, clothes with secret flaps to dump sand from the tunnels as they walked casually during exercise hours. They created a full underground network, complete with rail carts, electric wiring, and wooden supports carved from bedboards. The scale of the operation was so extraordinary that even German guards later admitted, a little begrudgingly, they were impressed. But not every story ended in triumph. Of the 76 men who escaped through the tunnel, most were recaptured. 50 of them were executed on Hitler's direct orders, an act that violated every rule of war and shocked even some German officers. It was one of the darkest POW-related events of the entire conflict. Yet, the story doesn't end there. Because World War II captivity wasn't one-sided. German soldiers were also captured by the United States, Britain, Canada, and the Soviet Union, and their experiences varied drastically. In American-run camps, for example, many German POWs were shocked by the relatively humane conditions. They were given adequate food, medical care, and, most surprisingly, work programs that allowed them to earn small wages. Some even played soccer, held orchestras, or worked on farms in the American Midwest. Years later, many wrote memoirs saying they were treated better as prisoners than as soldiers in their own army. But when German soldiers were captured by the Soviets, the situation was reversed entirely. They faced starvation, forced marches through snow, brutal interrogations, and often death from exposure or disease. Some camps had mortality rates of 30%, 40%, even 60%. Many did not return until the mid-1950s, 10 years after the war. Then there was the Pacific Front, where the rules were even harsher. Captured Allied troops, especially Americans, British, Australians, and Filipinos, faced unimaginable treatment under the Japanese Imperial Army. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, starvation diets, beatings, tropical diseases left untreated, relentless forced labor, prisoners packed in camps designed for half the capacity, brutal punishment for the smallest infractions. To the Japanese military leadership of the time, surrender was seen as dishonor. Therefore, soldiers who surrendered were considered beneath contempt. This mindset shaped the cruelty of many Pacific POW camps. Some prisoners described the experience simply as a war that began when we were captured. And yet, even in the harshest camps, some guards defied orders to show small kindnesses, slipping rice to prisoners, looking the other way during secret acts of resistance, treating wounded soldiers with a quiet compassion that could have cost them their lives. It is one of the strange truths of war. Human cruelty and human kindness often exist inches apart, but captivity was more than survival. It was a test of spirit. There were secret radio receivers built from scrap metal, hidden diaries written on toilet paper, underground chapels, secret languages and codes between prisoners, communal efforts to keep morale alive, and escape plots, hundreds of them, many doomed, some successful, all courageous. Each prison camp became its own universe, with its own rules, its own heroes, its own tragedies. And behind every barbed wire fence, there was one question echoing through every soldier's mind. Will I ever go home? Some would not. And some would return home physically alive, but emotionally hollow, their memories locked away where even their families could not reach. Everything about war is destruction, but captivity destroys in a slower, quieter way. As the war dragged on, conditions worsened, supplies dwindled, bombings intensified, camps were evacuated overnight. Prisoners were forced into marches through snow, rain, mud, and rubble. Some collapsed, some vanished, some were liberated by advancing troops in moments described as unbelievable waves of relief. But for many, liberation came with a cruel twist. They returned home changed in ways they could not explain, their bodies weakened, their dreams haunted, their faith in the world shaken. And yet, they survived. But this story is far from over, because what happened during captivity was only half of the truth. What happened at the very end, during the chaotic collapse of Nazi Germany, during the final days of the Pacific War, during the frantic evacuations, the hidden killings, the burning of documents, the abandoned camps, the desperate escapes, that part of the story is even darker, stranger, and more unbelievable. And to understand it, we must step deeper into the shadows where the rules of war no longer applied and where the fate of thousands of prisoners hung by a thread. Yet while the prisoners marched deeper into uncertainty, a darker reality was unfolding behind camp gates. One that history books often soften, but soldiers remembered with a trembling voice. Because captivity in World War II wasn't a single story. It was thousands of stories colliding. The brutal, the bizarre, the merciful, the unimaginable. And depending on where a soldier was captured, his fate could shift from grim survival to scientific experimentation to unexpected humanity. The war had rules, the Geneva Convention of 1929, but the war also had desperation, vengeance, ideology, starvation, and hate. And sometimes those forces spoke louder than laws. Inside the German stalags, the first shock came from the silence. Rows of barbed wire, drifting snow, the eerie chanting of guards on night patrol. Prisoners called these places the land of the living dead. But even among the horror, small pockets of hope flickered. In Stalag Luft 3, the camp that inspired the Great Escape, American and British airmen became master engineers. Using spoons, tin cans, bedboards, even powdered milk tins, they built elaborate tunnels with ventilation systems, trolleys, and pulley lines. The Germans considered them dangerous but clever. The prisoners considered themselves free men in training. Every morning, the guards counted men who had spent the entire night digging beneath their boots. But elsewhere, hope was a luxury. On the Eastern Front, Soviet prisoners arrived in German camps as walking skeletons. The Nazis saw them not as enemies, but as inferior. Over 3 million Soviet POWs died, more than the population of some countries, from starvation, exposure, untreated disease, and execution. Some were forced into labor battalions, some into mine clearing. Some never even made it to the camps. And the world outside often had no idea. But the brutality wasn't one-sided, and this is the part history rarely whispers. Captured German soldiers in Soviet custody stepped into their own nightmare. Prisoners marched through snow so deep that footprints vanished seconds later. Some collapsed from hunger and were buried beneath it. The Soviets, furious over the monstrous Nazi invasion of their homeland, offered little mercy. Weather did half the killing. Exhaustion did the rest. One German prisoner later wrote, open quote, "The cold did not bite, it carved," close quote. Yet within the same Soviet system, a strange paradox existed. Some captured Germans were sent to propaganda camps where they received better food, classes, and even political lectures. Why? Because the Soviets believed they could be converted, reshaped into anti-Nazi voices to broadcast messages back to the front lines. War was not just bullets and trenches. War was psychological warfare. War was a struggle to break not only bodies, but belief. And then there was an entirely different world, the Pacific. For Allied soldiers captured by Imperial Japan, the rules of war dissolved instantly. Japan had not signed the Geneva Convention. Their warrior code, Bushido, viewed surrender as unforgivable weakness. So prisoners became something worse than enemies. They became dishonored beings. On the Bataan Death March, American and Filipino troops staggered across 60 miles of blistering heat, beaten, bayoneted, shot for slowing down, dehydrated until their blood thickened. One survivor said, open quote, "You could hear the men dying. Their breath slowed, then stopped. It became normal." Close quote. In Japanese camps, prisoners were used as forced labor to build airfields, railroads, and tunnels. Malaria spread like wildfire. Dysentery drained men until they were unrecognizable. Rice rations were so small they joked they were being fed steam. But humor was how they stayed alive. Some dug secret hideouts to cook stolen rice. Some sabotaged Japanese equipment so subtly it looked like wear and tear. Some formed underground universities, teaching math, navigation, or history to keep their minds from collapsing. Even in hell, the human spirit tried to remain human. But there was something even darker, something the world didn't fully understand until after Japan surrendered. Unit 731. A facility so horrific that soldiers didn't know whether to call it a prison camp or a slaughterhouse. Captured Chinese, Korean, American, and Soviet soldiers were not shot or starved. They were experimented on. Vivisection, disease injection, frostbite exposure, biological weapons testing. Scientists carved open men while they were still alive to observe organ function. They froze limbs to test how long flesh could survive ice. They engineered diseases that could wipe out entire cities. And when the war ended, some of these scientists negotiated immunity in exchange for their research, which the United States quietly acquired and locked away. This was the part of World War II that many governments preferred to bury under paperwork, because the truth was simple. Captured soldiers were currency, bargaining chips, test subjects, propaganda tools, laborers, leverage, souvenirs of war, and sometimes they were saved by the most unexpected people. In 1944, during the Allied push into Italy, a group of captured British soldiers experienced something unbelievable. Their German captors didn't torture them. They didn't starve them. They didn't beat them. Instead, they protected them. Why? Because the German commander knew the war was collapsing, and he knew one thing. He would rather surrender to the British than to the Soviets. So he treated the POWs as honored guests. He housed them near the officers' quarters. He fed them better meals. He consulted their opinions on the war's progress. When the end came, he walked them straight to Allied lines, saluted the British commander, and said, open quote, "I deliver these men to you alive. Please remember this." Close quote. War could twist cruelty into survival. War could twist humanity into strategy. But war could also twist mercy into fear. And then there were the women, the forgotten prisoners. Captured nurses, intelligence operatives, and resistance fighters faced dangers unlike any frontline soldier. In the Philippines, American and Australian nurses captured by Japanese forces were imprisoned for 3 brutal years. They faced starvation, disease, and near constant terror. Yet they formed secret medical teams, treating wounded civilians and prisoners with whatever scraps they could find. They became known as the Angels of Bataan, and many saved more lives in captivity than some surgeons saved in hospitals. In Europe, female resistance fighters captured by the Gestapo were interrogated with methods designed to break the mind rather than the body. Sleep deprivation, mock executions, isolation chambers, threats against family, but some refused to break. Women in the French resistance, Polish underground, and Soviet partisan units endured torture and still protected mission secrets that saved entire divisions. And then there was the most chilling story, Ravensbrück, the concentration camp for women. Here, political prisoners, resistance fighters, and captured civilians were subjected to medical experiments, forced labor, and executions. But even here, women formed underground networks to smuggle medicine, steal food, sabotage Nazi operations, and hide children targeted for death. Some women who survived Ravensbrück later testified that they stayed alive not by strength but by code, a secret agreement between prisoners to keep each other awake, fed, and sane. One survivor said, open quote, "The Nazis made us prisoners, but we made each other human." Close quote. But prisoners didn't just survive, they escaped in ways you would never imagine. A group of British officers escaped a German camp by building a glider in the attic, waiting for the perfect storm to lift it over the walls. A group of Soviet prisoners dug a tunnel so long it took 90 days and more than 100 men to complete, carved with spoons and hidden with mud bricks made of their own sweat. A group of American prisoners in the Pacific escaped by disguising themselves as Japanese workers, stealing clothes, hats, and even tools, and walking out of the camp gate. The war turned ordinary men into magicians. Some tunneled, some climbed, some bargained, some waited, some inched forward day by day until liberation arrived like a dream they no longer believed in. And then the gates opened. When liberation finally came, it came in every form imaginable. American tanks smashing through German camp fences, Soviet soldiers bulldozing open POW barracks, British paratroopers landing inside Japanese-held territories, local resistance fighters storming labor camps before Allied armies even arrived. Prisoners cried. Prisoners collapsed. Some prisoners were so starved that doctors had to reintroduce food slowly, hour by hour, to avoid killing them. But all of them, every single survivor, walked out with a truth the world still struggles to fully accept. War doesn't end when the guns fall silent. War ends when the prisoners walk free. And even then, war follows them home. Some lived long, peaceful lives. Some woke up screaming for decades. Some refused to speak of what they saw. Some wrote books to make sure the world never forgot. But all of them carried one haunting memory: the moment they realized the world had forgotten them, and the moment the world remembered again. Because what truly happened to captured soldiers in World War II wasn't just brutality or suffering. It was a universe of stories. Stories of fear, hope, cruelty, resistance, survival, resilience, and the thin line between life and death. Stories that remind us that even in the darkest war humanity ever fought, humans still reached for light.